This is the third video of my Constitution on the Liturgy review and commentary. So we're moving into the reform of the sacred liturgy we talked about a little bit last time. And so first, always when the council did anything, they always started off with why they were doing it. So in paragraph 21, we see that they want to help the Christian people derive an abundance of graces from the sacred liturgy more than they had been. So they want to restore, in general, the liturgy itself. And they recognize here that the liturgy is made up of unchanging elements that Jesus Christ himself instituted and the apostles carried out. And then there are also elements subject to change. So for instance, you will always in the Mass have a Eucharistic prayer with a consecration of the bread and wine so that they become the real body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus Christ. You cannot change that just because we're 2,000 years into the Christian era. And the other elements, for instance, the lectionary readings. Before the council, there were 2 readings at Mass, generally from the epistle, typically of St. Paul, and then the gospel. There's always been a gospel, so that's really not changeable, but which readings are used is changeable. And in the Restoration, they're telling us that both the texts and the rite should be drawn up to express more clearly the holy things which they signify. That is not something that is particularly difficult to understand, but they want to express things that they signify. So they want clear language so that the Christian people can understand them. And this translation with ease, maybe not so good, because some things just can't be made easy. You've got to take time and study, for instance, with St. Paul's letter to the Philippians or to the Romans. So that's not what they mean. What they mean is so that there's no added difficulties in there. So there is some general norms that are established, and then they will show you some particular norms with respect to things like pastoral needs. All right, so first, the regulation of the liturgy depends solely on the authority of the Church, and that is the Apostolic See, Rome. And as laws may determine, so if Rome says, well, the bishop has the right to change this and this and this, then the bishop can make some decisions and make some changes. The regulation of the liturgy within certain defined limits belongs to the various kinds of competent territorial bodies. Now, what does that mean? Well, in the United States, for instance, we have the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. They are a competent territorial body. And so they approved the translations as they did. There were some provisional translations that came out almost immediately after the council. They were very, very close to the original Latin, what was already being used. And then in 1970, we got an entirely different, not totally different, but much more different set of directions and text to use. That was then it changed off and on over the next years. And we had a big change in 2010 to take the prayers, for instance, and make them closer to the original Latin. So no other person, even a priest, can add, remove, or change anything on the liturgy on his own authority. Almost immediately, that began to be disobeyed. And there was all kinds of things that were going on in the experimental phase of the liturgy. So this one was badly followed. In 23 we see, here we go, here's the reason. So that sound tradition may be retained and yet be open to the legitimate progress, careful investigation is to be made into each part which is to be revised. Not entirely clear if this was always followed. The investigation should be theological, historical, and pastoral. Sometimes the pastoral took over, and the historical and theological was kind of not particularly done right. The general laws must be studied in conjunction with the experience derived from recent liturgical reforms. There was, for instance, a change in the Mass in 1958, and from indults conceded to various places. So there are certain areas where a traditional liturgy has been formed that is not exactly the Latin rite. And no innovations unless the good of the Church genuinely and certainly requires them. The introduction of what was called the folk Mass, I don't know about requires them. That has always been something that I've wondered about. Some of us were really pushing for changes, especially in the music and the texts, and in many cases it went way too far. We always remember the so-called polka Mass. And they want to avoid big differences in rites used in adjacent regions of the world. Now, in 24, we see an extremely important point, and this was generally followed. Sacred Scripture is of the greatest importance in the celebration. That's where we get the lessons, that's where we get the substance of the homily. Psalms being sung, prayers, collects, and liturgical songs are derived almost always from the Scripture. And from the Scripture's actions and signs derive their meaning. So the breaking of the bread is described in many places in the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles. And that helps us to understand the meaning of the breaking of the bread, particularly as the sacrificial element of the Mass. And here we see Eastern and Western rites give testimony to the love for the Scripture. And then they tell us that the liturgical books are to be revised. Following this was what we got in 1970, and that was used for really the better part of 50 years. All right, the next set of norms come from the hierarchic and communal nature of the liturgy. We are a church, we are a hierarchical church. We have, not everybody is of equal authority, although all are of equal dignity. So a recognition that liturgical services, wherever they are celebrations of the whole church, and that the sacrament of unity, particularly the Eucharist, has to be respected. So they pertain to the whole body of the church, have effects on it and manifest it, but they concern different individual members, you and me, in different ways, according to different rank, office, and actual participation. Notice they use the word actual here. It is to be stressed that whenever rites make provision for communal celebration, the way of celebrating them is to be preferred to a celebration that is individual and quasi-private. For instance, individual masses by a single priest are no longer allowed in the Vatican. That has changed. You used to be able to say a private mass with, say, just an altar server. Can't do that anymore in the Vatican. And always the Mass is of first importance in administration of baptism, confirmation, and the others. Each person who has an office to perform, layperson, deacon, priest, bishop, should do all of those parts, but only those parts pertaining to the office. So, for instance, if there is a deacon at the Mass, the priest may not proclaim the gospel. Now servers, lectors, commentators, and members of the choir, they have a liturgical function too. And there has to be some internal change that occurs, piety and decorum. So, for instance, the decorum issue, if you have a choir, especially if they're at the front of the church, you shouldn't be wearing shorts or tank tops. They should be dressed as formally as possible. All must be deeply imbued with the spirit of the liturgy, and that means education. That means training. So you have to understand the why and the how and the who of the liturgy, not just the what to do. Now, remember, to promote engaged participation, people should have acclamations, like the gospel acclamation, responses, such as the responsorial psalm refrain, antiphons, songs, actions, gestures, and bodily attitudes. That doesn't mean liturgical dance, but it does mean we stand together, we kneel together, we sit together, and there are different attitudes corresponding to each. Sitting, for instance, is a good listening position. Standing is used for the gospel as a sign of respect and honor for the Jesus Christ of the liturgy. Provision of rubrics also for the people's parts, and you will see that in the new books, that the people respond. So, for instance, in the Eucharistic prayer, the priest says the preface, prays the preface, and then the people, it doesn't say the priest and people, it says the people and the deacons, of course, are going to sing or say the Holy, 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 the Sanctus. And that's in the book. Distinction between persons according to function and sacred orders. Due honors given to civil authorities. So you always recognize, say, if the president or the governor is present at a liturgical function, that is generally recognized even before the Mass begins. But no special honors to be paid in the liturgy to any private persons or classes of persons, whether in the ceremonies or by external display. One of the things that has happened in many parishes is applause for the music at the end of Mass. That really kind of violates this provision, and many musicians do not feel good about it, and that's something that really ought to be suppressed. Now, we have here a set of norms that are based upon the didactic and pastoral nature of the liturgy, and I'm going to push that off for the next in this series. So this is the end of our third presentation on Sacrosanctum Concilium.